Hi guys, I'm sorry about this, but we need to do it this way because my wife was unfortunately in a car accident yesterday, and I'm in a situation where you guys have to get through these notes. We can't lose any more days. So you guys are going to watch this screencast of the notes. Mr. Wolf is going to play this during class, and then you are going to get these notes or the link to the screencast. So what you need to do is follow along with what I say. I'm not going to stop to give you time to write during the screencast, but you can go back and play the video over, pause it, copy down the notes, go to the next slide, pause it, copy down the notes, and get everything that you've done. This is basically all we would have done yesterday is what I'm going to talk about with you guys so that you guys are not behind the other classes. We don't really have the time to move on. So this chapter is about the judiciary. So when we look at how the chapter is going to break down, we're going to talk about understanding the federal judiciary. There's a lot of misconceptions because we focus way more on the Supreme Court than any other aspect of the courts. We're going to talk about the different types of courts, the politics of what goes into appointing judges. Obviously, we've already talked a lot about that with Justice Scalia, so you already have a good understanding of that part. And then how the Supreme Court works and decides things, and the judicial power and the limits that they have. So when we look at the characteristics of the federal judiciary, like I just said, for the most part, when people think about the federal courts, they think about the Supreme Court, which is 9 judges. Okay, the reality is there's a lot of other courts involved. There's circuit courts, there's district courts, there's tax courts, and those courts are all heavily involved in all the decision making at different levels. The Supreme Court's just that top level. Okay, there's over 10,000 cases that are appealed to the Supreme Court from all the other courts every single year, and the Supreme Court only hears about 150. Actually, a lot of years it's less than that. It's closer to 100. So when you look at what the Supreme Court's doing, it's actually a very small chunk of the total work done. Now, obviously, they're the most important court, and they're doing the biggest amount. So when you look at all the different courts out there, all the judges are appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate, and they are appointed for life. And so when the president appoints the different judges, they sit, they serve for life, they get done, they move on. So the president's not going to fill every seat every year, just like with the Supreme Court. Currently, this is a huge point of contention with the Democrats because President Obama has appointed a bunch of judges that the Republicans in the Senate have refused to appoint. Now, the limelight goes to the Supreme Court appointments. So normally with the Supreme Court, the media is involved, the coverage is there, everybody's going absolutely crazy, so they can't stall. But all these lesser judges, they can do what they want, and most of us don't even notice. And that's what the Republicans have been doing. I was watching a 60 Minutes news report last year at the end of the year, and they were talking about there were 300 positions that hadn't been filled. And of those 300 positions that hadn't been filled, that was roughly 25% of the workload. So the judges are furious because 75% of the total number of judges that they're supposed to be are trying to do 100% of the work. So there's backlog in a lot of cases. There's a lot of situations where the judges are overworked and they're struggling and they're just frustrated. Okay, and that'll go into the politics of the position. Okay, but just to realize that that's not just the Supreme Court. And then you have the concept of judicial review, which we've already talked about a lot. In judicial review, you're looking at the Marbury versus Madison case and the ability of the U.S. Supreme Court to rule whether or not an action is constitutional or unconstitutional. Okay, now we're going to talk about this in a couple minutes. The key part there is that action unconstitutional or constitutional? Okay, not whether or not you should be doing it, because that's a huge issue that we'll talk about, is the court cannot tell the other people how to do their job. That's not a good thing. And then we have this issue of the adversary system in our court system. So in our court system, you have one person representing, or your lawyer, whatever, representing your side, the other lawyer or other people involved on the other side, and your adversaries with each other. Your Iron Man versus Thor, or well, not a bad example, but you're fighting against each other. Okay, so your Batman versus Joker, whoever can provide the best argument, the judge is going to agree with, and they win the case system. Okay, that's how most of our cases are handled. There's this other way of doing things, and it's called mediation. And the way that mediation works, and it's not used in a lot of cases, but mediation works that somebody comes in and you try to find a compromise. You try to find that middle ground. You look at the root of the issue and you try to decide on different solutions and how do you handle those solutions. So we see that mediation used a lot You're not going to use it with criminal cases. You know, if somebody does a bad thing, that's not going to be the case. But there are sometimes with civil cases, especially at the state level, we see it a lot with family law. Okay, the idea is that if you're getting a divorce and you're not in a horrible situation where you're fighting tooth and nail and trying to stick it to each other, you come in, you sit down with the mediator, you have your lawyer, they have their lawyer, and the mediator says, okay, first issue, what's the best environment for the kids? And the mother will make her case, the father will make her case, the mediator will kind of shape that and say, and try to come to a compromise that both people can agree to rather than there being one winner. Okay, so we see that with lawsuits from time to time. We see that with negotiation contracts. We see that in family court. It's not the main way we do things. We mainly use the adversary system, but that does come up from time to time with that mediation. Okay. And then you have the two different types of law, the two different types of courts that we have. We have criminal law, which means you broke the law, you're being tried for breaking the law. And then we have civil law, which deals with who bears responsibility in this situation. And then based off of that responsibility for a situation happening that is bad, what do you owe the other person, or what is the way to remedy the situation? And we'll look at that in the next slide. So looking at this with the civil law, okay, overall predominantly the penalties are going to be monetary, especially at the federal. So I'm driving down the street, I get in a car accident, you get hurt, I was doing something I shouldn't be doing, texting on my phone, and now who pays your medical bills? Who's responsible for your pain and suffering? Your lost time at work, those kind of things. That's my fault, I owe you something. You know, that's civil lawsuit. Okay, now this has become a huge thing, especially in the corporate world, because we see lawsuits all the time. People are constantly suing. In the United States, you can sue and file a lawsuit for any reason possible. Now, the judge can throw it out. The judge does not have to hear the case. They can review the case and say, you don't have anything, and throw it out. But because you can file any lawsuit, we hear about lawsuits all the time. Not all of them are true. You'll remember, I'm sure you guys have heard about, there is a lawsuit from the early 90s of the woman that sued McDonald's, okay, for hot coffee. And so the situation was reported in the news, a woman spills hot coffee on herself, sues McDonald's because the coffee was too hot, wins millions upon millions of dollars. Okay. But the problem is that's just the headlines. And so because of that, people are going crazy suing stuff, but they don't actually realize what happened in the lawsuit. So if you remember, I said the lawsuits and civil lawsuits are to find the remedy for the situation. So you have two parts to a remedy. The first is what needs to be done in this immediate situation. What needs to be done to rectify what is happening today? And the second part is what needs to be done to address preventing this from happening in the future, keeping this from being an issue down the road. So the reality in the case with the woman that got burnt by the coffee at McDonald's is she was a 68-year-old woman that went to McDonald's to buy coffee. McDonald's was holding this campaign that they had the hottest coffee in the world and that they had the best coffee in the world because of this. She bought her cup of coffee, put it between her legs, pulled out, was driving down, hit a bump, coffee spilt out of the top of the cup, all over her legs, gave her third-degree burns. The FDA, federal regulation, says you cannot serve coffee that's over 180 degrees hot. The coffee was like 220 degrees hot. McDonald's was knowingly serving coffee at such a boiling point or hot point that it would cause third-degree burns when they knew they weren't allowed to do that. So she did sue, and she sued for her medical damages, she sued for all that. So the immediate issue in fixing that issue was paying for medical bills, paying for the hardships, doing that. And that was roughly about $250,000. But the court also said, or the jury also said, in order to prevent this from happening again down the road, McDonald's needs to be punished a little bit. So we're going to charge McDonald's 2 days worth of profits for the hot coffee. So for however much money McDonald's makes for 2 days, that is what they have to pay up on top of everything else to make sure they don't do this down the road. Now you stop and think about it. 2 days worth of profits from one product really is a reasonable punishment to prevent this from happening again, so on and so forth. But the problem that they didn't realize is 2 days worth of profits for coffee for McDonald's was $250 million. So that's what the media jumped all over, is this $1 million, all this other stuff. Now the judge stepped in and made it reasonable, so the old lady only ended up getting $250,000, but those numbers still got out there, so people went nuts. So then people started suing for everything. but that doesn't mean that you're going to actually get your case anywhere. There's been some interesting cases. The guy sued M&Ms because there were plain M&Ms in his peanut bag, and when he was trying to bite through the plain M&Ms, he used so much force because he thought they were peanut, he bit through his lip, and they said that that was an error in their product that they shouldn't have had out there, and it caused him to harm himself. They didn't win millions; he won enough to cover fixing his lip in that situation. The weirdest one that I've ever heard of is that a gentleman who had never bought in a car, or he hadn't bought in a car since like the 60s, he was an older guy, went and bought a mobile home, an RV. And he was on the freeway, he left the lot, and he was driving, saw cruise control or automatic control, hit it because he had to go to the bathroom. And he went back and to go to the bathroom while the car was on the freeway thinking it would drive itself. Obviously an accident happened because cruise control only sets the speed limit, doesn't actually control the car. So they came back and said, you can't do that. You have to put a warning to explain what these features are so that people that don't know what the features are don't misuse them. Okay, now I know that sounds very, very silly, and you guys are probably giggling right now with that. But that's a part of that remediation, or that mediation, and I'm sorry, I'm using the wrong word. Reconciliation of the situation and making sure it doesn't happen down the road. Now we also have this issue of responsibility. So in civil law, you'll oftentimes see rulings that the media will jump on that say, oh, they ruled this crazy thing. And all they actually ruled was responsibility. Okay, and we see this with the baggy pants issue. So for example, one of the reasons that we harp on baggy pants at school is, let's say a fire alarm breaks out. You're running down the hall with baggy pants. You trip and fall and break your kneecap. You sue the school because you got hurt at school. The court may come back and say, look, you were wearing baggy pants. 60% of this was your fault for wearing the baggy pants. But because somebody fooled the fire alarm and it was an issue at school, the school is responsible for 40%. Well, we don't want to be responsible for anything. So when we see that percentage come into play, that impacts what's going on. Now, the news is only going to report that a school got sued and lost the case, that they had to pay money for baggy pants. That's not the whole story. So you will see sometimes percentage of responsibilities depending on what's going on. So when you're talking about civil law, it's going to be dominantly money given out, but that's not always the case. Sometimes if you can fix the situation without paying money, the court will be fine with that, as long as that situation is fixed and there's no harm, no foul. We just think of the ambulance chasers that are going after people that have been hurt, and that's always going to generally involve money because you've been hurt. Now, with civil law, you have no right to a government-provided attorney, and you have no right to a jury. You can get a jury in some cases if you both agree and there's circumstances there, but that doesn't. You have no right to any of those things. They're not covered under the 4th and 5th Amendment, whereas compared to criminal law, they are. So if you notice down below with criminal law, if you can't afford an attorney, you will get one. Why? Because your liberty or your freedom is at stake. This is a huge issue. Okay, we do not want you to get convicted of a crime where you could go to jail, you could lose everything about your lifestyle without being able to properly work and go through the due process of the system. So the 4th, 5th, and 6th Amendment protects your right to an attorney. You have a right to a jury. You have a right to proper due process, basically. Now, what is a criminal law? Criminal law centers on you breaking the law. Okay, so whenever the government writes down a law, whether it's the state government or the federal government and the Congress, and that law goes into official law of the land, it's a rule. Okay, and you can't break it. If you break it, there's a punishment. And so a lot of these are obvious. You can't kill, murder, those kind of things. Some of those things are way more detailed, and like littering and those kind of things. Okay, but they're all written down. And when anything is written down, we call that statutory. Okay, all laws are going to be statutory laws. Now, some of you right now are thinking about, well, wait a second. I've heard statutory used in some terms and not. Okay, and on part 2, I'm going to talk about that. So Mr. Wolf is going to go ahead and load up part 2 while this stops right here. So keep paying attention, and I hope this isn't too bad for you guys.